Okay, hello and welcome to Tricycle's 30th anniversary celebration. I'm James Shaheen, Tricycle's editor-in-chief. This is the second live session in a series we'll host over the next several weeks. We'll be talking with many of the people, old friends and new, who have been central to Tricycle's success. Today's session will be recorded for anyone who is unable to attend live. You can view any of the session recordings as well as the speaker lineup and schedule for upcoming events at the same link that you're at now. We are providing these events for free, so if you haven't already and you want to support Tricycle, please consider donating at the button below. We will have some time for a Q&A towards the end of this hour-long discussion. You can ask a question by typing it into the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can. Okay, so today our guests are Marie Myung-Ok Lee and Arthur Sze. Marie is an occasional contributor to Tricycle. Her novel, The Evening Hero, will be published by Simon & Schuster in 2022. She teaches fiction at Columbia, where she is writer-in-residence. I should also add that I'm a big fan of yours, Marie, so it's great to have you here.
I'm a big fan of yours, too, and of Tricycle's.
Oh, thank you. Arthur Sze is the author of 11 books of poetry, including Sightlines, which won the National Book Award for Poetry in 2019. And Compass Rose, a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He is the recipient of many other honors, including the Jackson Poetry Prize from Poets and Writers and a Guggenheim Fellowship. He lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and his new and collected poems, The Glass Constellation, was released today. So congratulations to you, Arthur.
Thank you.
That's another milestone. Okay, so we thought it would be nice to put these two wonderful writers together. So Arthur and Marie, I'm going to disappear for a while and turn it over to you before we do the Q&A later. So again, thank you both so much for joining us. It's very generous of you.
Great.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Well, take it away, Arthur.
Okay. I want to start just by thanking James for inviting me to be on this program to help celebrate Tricycle's 30th anniversary, and may there be many, many more anniversaries. I'm going to read 4 poems from my new and collected poems, and then Marie and I are going to just talk a little bit. This first poem is called Doppler Effect. Stopped in cars, we are waiting to accelerate along different trajectories. I catch the rising pitch of a train. Today, 109 people died in a stampede converging at a bridge. Radioactive water trickles underground toward the Pacific Ocean. Nickel and copper particulates contaminate the Brocade River. Will this planet sustain 10 billion people? Switch it. A spider plant leans toward a glass door, and 6 offshoots dangle from it. The more I fingered the clay slab into a bowl, the more misshapen it became. Though I have botched this, bungled that, the errancies reveal it would not be better if things happened just as I wished. A pufferfish inflates on deck. A burst of burnt rubber rises from pavement. First snow. A rabbit has stopped on the gravel driveway. Imbibing the silence, you stare at spruce needles. There's no sound of a leaf blower, no sign of a black bear. A few weeks ago, a buck scraped his rack against an aspen trunk. A carpenter scribed a plank along a curved stone wall. You only spot the rabbit's ears and tail. When it moves, you locate it against speckled gravel. But when it stops, it blends in again. The world of being is like this gravel. You think you own a car, a house, this blue zigzagged shirt, but you just borrow these things. Yesterday, you constructed an aqueduct of dreams and stood at Gibraltar, but you possess nothing. Snow melts into a pool of clear water, and in this stillness, starlight behind daylight wherever you gaze. This next poem is called Crisscross, and it blends two worlds. It brings two worlds back and forth in conjunction with each other. And the first world is the American Southwest. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and this poem is set in the Milwaukee Valley, about 20 miles north of Santa Fe. And the other world that comes in intermittently in this poem are images from Europe. Though it's not named specifically, it's from Rotterdam.
Right.
Crisscross. Meandering across a field with wild asparagus, I write with my body the characters for grass, water, transformation, ache to be one with spring, biting into watermelon, spitting black seeds onto a plate. I watch the eyes of an Armenian accordion player, and before dropping a few euros into his brown cap, smell sweat and fear. I stay wary of the red horse Relampago, latch the gate behind me. A thorned Russian olive branch arcs across the path below my forehead. And approaching the Milwaukee River, I recall the sign, beware pickpockets, find backhoe tracks, water diverted into a ditch. Crisscrossing the stream, I catch a lightning flash, the white-capped Truchas Peaks behind to the east. And in the interval between lightning and thunder, as snow accumulates on black branches, the chasm between what I envision and what I do. And this next poem, the last poem I'm going to read, is also the last poem in the book, Transpirations. It's written out in one-line stanzas, so there's silences between each of the lines. Transpirations. Leafing branches of a backyard plum. Branches of water on a dissolving ice sheet. Chatter of magpies when you approach. Lilacs lean over the road, weighted with purple blossoms. Then the noon sun shimmers the grasses. You ride the surge into summer. Smell of pinon crackling in the fireplace. Blued notes of a saxophone in the air. Not by sand running through an hourglass, but by our bodies igniting. Passing in the form of vapors from a living body. This world of orange sunlight and wildfire haze. World of iron filings pulled toward magnetic south and north. Pool of quicksilver when you bend to tie your shoes. Standing, you well up with glistening eyes. Have you lived with utmost care? Have you articulated emotions like the edges of leaves? Adjusting your breath to the seasonal rhythm of grasses? gazing into a lake on a salt flat and drinking in reflection the Milky Way. Thank you. There.
Thank you, Arthur, it's such a treat to hear the poet read his own work. I'm going to take a minute to compose myself. That was such a good reading. And I want to congratulate you on the release of this gorgeous and also physically beautiful book, Glass Constellations. I'm a longtime admirer of your work, and I'm really honored to be in conversation with you. So why don't we start with the granular about Doppler effect? Why don't we talk about what ways does this poem show like a Buddhist slant?
Thanks. I think on the initial sort of quick glance, Doppler effect as a title invokes modern science, like the poem has the rising pitch of a train. So presumably the speaker of the poem who's in a car waiting for the train to go by and then start driving, the whole time of the poem is in the interval between being stopped and starting again. And it might not appear to have a lot of Buddhist principles or ideas, but in hindsight, and certainly when I'm writing, I don't think, oh, this is going to be like a Buddhist poem. I do think there is the sense of having an empty mind when one is creating that's really important to discovering what the poem is really about. In hindsight, I can look at Doppler effect and say, oh, isn't it interesting that in the first half of the poem, there's a kind of building of inner pressure. When I look at the poem, after having written it and looking back, there's the sense of, contamination with nickel particulates coming down the river, coming down the Brocade River. There's the sense of, there's increasing pressure. There's the kind of, in the mind of the speaker, a kind of building of pressure, a kind of attachment to, I wouldn't say suffering overtly, but it becomes maybe overt with the sense of, oh my God, can this planet sustain 10 billion people? It sort of erupts at that point, this escalation of feeling the sort of burden of the world on it. And in that sense, for me, it connects to Buddhism with that sense of attachment, and which, is fundamental, the idea that attachment leads to suffering. And in this particular poem, as nuanced as it is, there's this sense of increasing pressure, building and building, and then suddenly the speaker says, switch it. And to me, it's like this whole turn and release. The speaker's like, what can you do with the world's problems? They just mount and get bigger and heavier and insurmountable, and the weight just grows. And then when the speaker says, switch it, there's the sudden release. And the next image that occurs is a spider plant leaning toward the sunlight, which, again, I can only say in hindsight, but I feel like the reason that image earned its way in the poem is there's something natural in seasonal rhythms, a plant reaching for the sun. And then the speaker goes on to recognize, things wouldn't be better if they happened just as I wished. If I or you or someone were in total control, that doesn't make the world any better. In fact, it would also be a miserable place too. But so there's that sense of release and a sense of recognition. And then when the fugu, the blowfish, is brought on deck, and I mentioned fugu because it's a delicacy, right, of sushi and Japanese Asian cuisine. Yeah. But there's also that sense of a return of a sliver of overpopulation, overfishing,
right,
maybe, of people consuming delicacies, and it's not done in any polemical way. And then you get this last sensation, which is burnt rubber. Somebody else is like tearing out of the position and going on to where they need to go. But something I think has maybe changed in the mind of the speaker. He's not so anxious to go tearing off to where he was headed. And for me, that makes Doppler effect a really interesting Buddhist poem, almost like coming in from the side. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And just when we were sort of chatting in the green room, where you're saying you don't have a a meditation practice, but it has such an effect of when you're trying to sit for meditation and then your mind is like booming all over the place and then you're trying to pull it back. But even in the pulling back, you get mad at yourself because you're not doing it right. And then so in a certain way, there's a certain gentleness and acceptance of course it's going to be like this and the fugu fish is going to die and it's going to be polluted, but you still just try to bring it back as best as you can. And so despite some of the sort of violent imagery, there's also just a sense of continuation and just sort of doing your best, which really is peaceful, almost a peaceful image to some degree. But then, so I also want to talk a little bit about how in previous interviews, you've talked a lot about how you use juxtaposition as a vision of the world. And in Doppler effect in particular, you have these juxtapositions of the stampede on the bridge, radioactive water, spider plant, fugu fish. And I know that you use a lot of nature imagery, but I guess I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about, so where do these images come from? Do you read the paper all the time? Are you talking to your friends or is it just an empty mind and the images come in?
I think I told James my writing practice is to have a thermos of hot coffee waiting for me in the morning, and I sit down and I try and write into the sunrise. And so for me, the process of writing is mysterious, but it oftentimes involves shedding intellectual control, that's self trying to assert control of the world or whatever. If I know where the poem is going ahead of time, usually those poems aren't that interesting or they don't work out that well for me. I can use them as a draft to get started, but for me, oftentimes the real interest to the poem are sort of at the periphery, just at the edge of where one can see, or maybe just beyond what one can see, and then they come into view. So I tend to write and make a mess of things and not know where the poem is going. Sometimes the poem will start with an image. Sometimes it'll be a phrase. It'll be sound or rhythm. And I can't really generalize. In Doppler effect itself, I think I had this sensation of how when you're moving along and you suddenly stop, your mind is still like things are racing through your mind, like you were talking about meditation. So I was just letting images flow out onto the page and looking at them. And I knew that I had this sensation of a speaker sort of stopped at an intersection. I don't know that I knew when I started it was going to be a train, but I did have this idea of how everyone is in a kind of private world when they're stopped at a red light in a car, and then suddenly everyone goes on their way. So I had this sense of isolation, but also maybe continuity or communion in unforeseen ways. So as I was working on the poem, the image of the contaminated Brocade River came to me, and that's a specific memory. In Chengdu, China, in the Tang Dynasty in the 700s. One of the great women poets, Xue Tao, lived there, and her tower is actually still there. You can kind of visit. It's in this bamboo park, and right outside of the park is the Brocade River, which is where in the 700s women dyed indigo yarn and then they washed it out in the river, and that's how it got its name. And I was thinking about how beautiful that naming is, but today, you know how China is an environmental disaster. Upstream are all these semiconductor plants and heavy metals are being dumped into the river. And when that sort of entered the poem, to me, it was like that gave it a kind of charge, a kind of urgency. And I think it led to the sense of overpopulation. But I can't linguistically or logically lay them out. What happens is I lay out these phrases all over the page or pages, and then I start to think about what has the most light and what has the most heat. And for me, the structure of Chinese characters is really crucial. So, for instance, if you write the character autumn in Chinese, you write a tip and then tree and then fire on the other side. So tree tips or plant tips juxtaposed with fire is the image for autumn. So for me, the juxtapositions only work if they have a kind of logic or inner necessity behind them. If they're just random juxtapositions, then I think you get diminishing returns. It's sort of like maybe surrealism at its worst, where it just feels arbitrary. But when the juxtapositions are surprising and they create some kind of tension and rigor, then I'm using a metaphor from science, magnetism. If there's the kind of attraction and repulsion, then I get really interested. I feel like maybe consciously in my mind, I can't articulate why, but I can feel that these images start needing to be pulled together, and like a magnet, the imagination is sort of drawing them together. And then I sort of just play a lot with that. And in that particular poem, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 times longer, and then I just stripped away what didn't feel essential. And I got to that sort of opening of stopped it, and then going at the end, and then the different sort of disparate images fell into place.
Oh, so it's sort of like your mind is like the magnet, and the filings will just eventually make their way. You kind of have to get out of your own way to make sure they come to you.
Yeah, and yet with the image of the iron filings, with the magnetism, they do start to form a pattern. And then as that pattern emerges, I sort of try and follow that. And it's not something I can enter a poem saying, okay, it's going to be about this, I'm going to do this. But suddenly I think like that image of the blowfish, it felt right for that to come in toward the end. It's kind of startling.
Right. So I'm gonna move on to the title of your talk, Meditative Poetry. And so crisscross is one that particularly strikes me as meditative. The way the lines keep crossing, and as we're talking a little bit about science and patterns, there's almost a fractal split in the way they split and they transform and then they cross again. And there's a little bit of a quantum, the two worlds. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about meditation in poetry, what that means to you.
I think meditation in poetry for me means balancing a kind of spontaneity and also a kind of rigor. So, and I don't formally practice meditation, but I'm guessing that it has connections with that practice, because as I understand it, part of it is sort of emptying your mind of different distractions, but also being aware of patterns that sort of pass through the consciousness. And I think for me, meditative poetry is trying to see to look at essentials, to see things that are really important, to let the sort of superficial, the scatterings, to sort of for them to dissipate or slide or flow off. And that sense of focusing involves deepening the experience. So, my poems people have said, oh, Arthur's poems are difficult or whatever. And I'm not writing to be difficult. I'm writing the poems that I feel are necessary to write. And that sometimes requires a density of language and a layering of language. So I might go through like 100 drafts to write the poem Crisscross. And it's not like I'm trying to brag or anything. It's just that the process of deepening, of trying to focus and find what's essential, to me, that's like the meditative process of sort of clearing out debris or the extraneous things. And then I like to use an organic metaphor, which is that for a poet, for a writer, mysterious phrases can be seeds, and you can't really be in a hurry. You have to like plant them and nourish them and let them grow and see what they become in fruition. So there are phrases one might not fully understand, and then if given time and nourishment, they sort of grow into the poem and they become essential to the poem. And again, that takes a lot of effort, a lot of sort of not just mental, but I would say emotional, imaginative stamina to, again, balance not being in a hurry, but still wanting to move things along in a way. So there's a kind of tension or a kind of dance that happens But ultimately, meditative poetry for me has to do with a kind of revelation too. And I suppose that approaches Buddhism in the sense of Satori, one of my favorite ancient Chinese poets that I've translated into English, Wang Wei. And James knows because we talked about Wang Wei in a podcast earlier, has these amazing poems in only 20 characters, 20 words in classical Chinese, like Kung Shan Bu Chen Ren, empty mountain, not see man. I mean, it starts with the paradox. What is an empty mountain? And it ends up with sunlight shining on a piece of green moss. And there's like no person. And that's like this amazing, riveting, exciting, exhilarating moment, which is the climax to the poem. And to me, that's like the fulfillment of this meditation. It's like some insight, some awareness that the poem has conveyed to the reader through language. So if I can, even just aspire to that, that's great.
But that's exactly that. I love that you were talking about like not being hurried. That's exactly what your poem is doing. It's not that it's difficult. It's that it forces you to read it very slowly. It has a accretion, but then it has that heart-stopping line. And I'm going to read it just to make sure. Let's see, I'm saying it right. The chasm between what I envision and what I do. To me, that was just like a baseball bat knocking me out after being in this meditative state. It's not only just sort of the gap of history opening up, like sort of a wound, but also I'd love for you to talk about, to me as an artist, it felt to me like the eternal gap between what I see and what I try to do as an artist, and that I will never achieve. And it's somewhat angering, but then secretly I think it's probably the reason most artists are motivated to do what they do. So I would love to hear what you have to say about it.
You said that so wonderfully. I'm not sure I can add a lot of insight to it. I'll say that literally in the poem, it's the chasm is the gap, literally, physically, between seeing a flash of lightning and then, listening and then hearing it. And so you're judging how far away or how close the lightning in fact is. But in that interval, which is sort of sight and sound, there's this huge chasm, this huge gulf, which, yes, as you say in the poem, turns into what someone sees and what they can actually do. And to apply that to writing, I think it's grueling and great. It's sort of like endlessly struggling to try and convey sometimes experiences that are beyond the grasp of language, or are deep enough where the language feels shallow, or that one can't quite get there. And the French poet Paul Valéry once said, he said he never finished a poem, he always abandoned them. And I sort of like that idea where you get to a certain point where it's like frustration, and I also have to say I do get to the point where I realize if I keep meddling with this, it's just going to get worse and worse. It's going to be like that Speaker and Doppler effect. It's going to be, everything's going to get disastrously mangled and misshapen. And so then you sort of abandon and let it go. And there's a sense of sort of exhaustion. And I think not being able to make that completion is part of what it is to be human, and we as artists feel it particularly of having a particular vision we're trying to harness the language into or convey the experience into, and we're always falling short. Always. So on the one hand, we sort of give up and then we try again, and we give up and we try again.
Well, so then I want to talk to you a little bit about Arthur Sze, the poet, and how you became a poet, and what you talked about, like the characters for Autumn. What's really interesting, and in Korean, there's a bunch of words for author, writer, novelist, but they're all just kind of these words. But the word for poet is also a compound word. It is poem person. So the poet is the only person who gets to be poem person. And I'm sure it's a Sino-Korean word, so I'm sure it's the same. I don't know if it's the same in Chinese, but I would just love for you, how do you become a poem person? Like, how did you did you know you were going to become a poet? Is this something you just become? Did someone tell you you're a poem person?
Well, let me start with the linguistics, because the Korean and the Chinese are similar. to write poet in Chinese, you write poetry and then you juxtapose person after it. But if you look at the character, poem or poetry, and there are debates, etymological debates on this. So I know what I'm about to say might be attacked by a linguist, but the left side is the character word, and the right side is the character temple. So it's hard to resist seeing word as sacred, as the word as devotion, that those two elements are in the character poetry. In terms of how I became a poet, it was not at all expected or planned. My father got his PhD at MIT in chemical engineering. I grew up in New York City and I was supposed to follow in his footsteps. So like a dutiful Asian American, I was good at math and science. I enrolled at MIT. And I remember being bored in a calculus lecture and just opening up a notebook page and I started writing. It was like, I could do the math, but it really wasn't that interesting to me. And then the next day I wrote some more, and the next day I wrote some more. And pretty soon I realized, wow, this is what I really want to do. That, you know, my family expectations were all, you know, math, science, engineering, sort of safe professional career. And this other thing happening was like, no, language, you know, poetry, just write, see what happens. And within a few months, I knew that that's what I wanted to do. You can imagine it was sort of horrible family stories about, you know, you're going to be a poet, what? You know, you're going to starve or whatever. But I transferred to MIT to University of California, Berkeley. It was the late 60s. I was very stubborn. I created my own major in poetry. I translated classical Chinese poetry into English, and I learned craft there. And so one thing led to another. It wasn't like premeditated at all.
Wow. But it's still, I'm going to be a poet. And here you are. And that leads to my next question is, so this book is really heavy because you have such a large body of work. And, you know, the last poem in it has been in the New Yorker. You won the National Book Award. So, and, you know, as you know, there's expectations. The writing world can be very unforgiving. So how do you, you know, the last part of your book is all these new poems. How do you keep, you know, what Suzuki would call the beginner's mind? Because now you're technically an expert.
Well, let's come back to beginner's mind, because I think that's always worth remembering or articulating. And it was, I think, Wittgenstein who said philosophy consists of a series of reminders. So, you know, in beginner's mind, the beginner can't do anything very well, but there are lots of possibilities. And in the expert's mind, you know, one does something very well, but the possibilities are then much more limited. And so I think to come back to that sort of chasm between what one sees or what one hopes to do and what one actually does, that gap, that chasm that might appear to be a curse is also a blessing, because it's what keeps me going as a poet. I feel like I'm never quite satisfied. I can never, if I've written a good poem, it's still only provisional. And I feel like the important thing is to keep evolving and growing the way one's life does, and like it or not, the challenges of living. So I haven't found it difficult to keep evolving. And in that last section of new poems, I laid them all out on the floor before putting them together. And I wanted to see if there were certain patterns running across them. And I could see that there were a lot of poems in one-line stanzas and dashes. And there's also a piece that's written off a Japanese form, the haiban, which Basho made, you know, incredibly important in Japan, the Oku no Hosomichi, the narrow road to the far north. I wrote a prose poem using prose blocks with a haiku, and then prose blocks. And then instead of another haiku, I wrote 2 7-syllable lines in English. I rarely count syllables. And I say this because it's an example of working against what one can do well. And I thought to myself, okay, I was going to write a poem that was prose and haiku, but actually I have this 5-7 5-syllable link in English. If I write 2 7-syllable links in English, those two make what's called a tanka, a short song, but it's in English. And if I separate them by prose, I'm breaking up a traditional Japanese form. Not that I expect an American reader to know this, but I thought, oh, it's an example of how one keeps pushing oneself to grow. And I thought, I've never attempted anything like this. But if I do this, there are going to be poems inside of poems inside of poems. There are going to be prose poems. There are going to be tankas, a 5-7 5-syllable link, a 7-7 syllable link. That makes a complete poem. And then there's a haiku, a 5-7 5, that's a complete poem. And if there are 4 of them, then it's like the 4 seasons, this rotation. And it sort of like was really exciting and mind-boggling to me, thinking, can I do this? And yeah, sometimes I'll try something, it'll be a complete failure. But I feel like for me, the way to keep evolving, to keep growing and not be trapped in sort of the expert's mind is to, of course, not take one's own work too seriously. And the other thing for me is to like lay poems out on the floor and say, okay, and I ask myself, what are the repeating patterns? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? What are things I could be trying that I've never tried before? And it's endless, as you know.
It's kind of funny too, because you probably are using certain mathematical like structures, even though you've disavowed science. There you go. It all becomes part of a continuum. And so do you have, I don't know, maybe this is more a fiction writer, or maybe this is just more me. I actually literally disavow some of my earlier work. When someone says, oh, I got your novel, I was like, don't read it. I was a different person when I wrote that. Is that something that you go through, or is that not something?
Maybe not as drastically. Let me say, when I put the Glass Constellation together, there are selections from my first 2 books of poems, because there are some poems I looked and I just thought, I don't need to see that again. A reader needs to see that again. But what I can do is select to show the kind of arc that there are glimmerings in those early poems. Like, these are okay, I can live with them. So I kind of did walk a tightrope where I thought, oh, some of these poems really just are a mess and they don't need to come back. They're better left out. But I did want that sense of an arc of a chronology. I wanted a reader to be able to see a kind of growth and transformation. So that's how some of the early poems earned their way in.
Okay. So I have a kind of just personal question that I'm just dying to ask you, because I don't even know how to say this. So for me, in general, I do tend to think I have sort of the monkey mind problem. I'm always thinking about things. I'm on social media all the time. Also, I have, I'm a parent, so I'm kind of compartmentalizing everything. I feel like the one time I can reliably be present is when I'm working, when I am writing, when I am creating. However, ironically, when I'm being present, I'm actually not being present in this world. I'm being present in a different world. So I'm not being present for my family. And a lot of what I do means like I've got to go away or like shut my door like I'm doing. How do you reconcile this being present, not being present when you're working?
It's hard. I don't have an easy answer to it because sometimes, well, as I said, I like to get up and work first thing in the morning. For me, that's really important because I'm not quite awake. I'm kind of in a dream time somehow, and that liminal space allows me to, again, it's sort of that tension and release of not being in fully control of the language, of playing with language. I feel like I'm more fertile and creative there. And then I know the phone's not going to ring at like 5 a.m, or not going to have to worry about. I have a separate writing space, so that's a help.
That does help.
Yeah, if you're in New York City and you're in a room, it's much harder. But if I can physically, which I can do, walk from the house to this space that I'm in where I write, then I feel like I can just go for it and not worry about what time it is and I'm not teaching, I'm retired. So just to be able to go for it every morning is such a gift and such a wonderful opportunity to have. But I do find, well, then I can also just say, okay, now I'm done and now I'm going to go about the rest of the day or whatever, sometimes my wife will say, well, wait a minute, where are you? You're
Right.
like, you're still, in your creating world or whatever.
Right. But I want to look at this stuff. I don't want to talk to you exactly.
Right. So
I didn't shut the cupboard door because I was busy in my head.
Right.
And so it just becomes difficult to live that way.
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's great. I want to make sure that we have tons of time for questions, because I think people have a lot of questions. But for my last question, this is so gorgeous. So could you just tell me a little bit more about the title, Glass Constellation?
Sure. So this comes right back to Buddhism, actually. And again, maybe a historian can correct me, but I think it starts with ancient Hinduism, what's called Indra's net, this cosmological image that everything that happens in the cosmos is like a hanging jewel, a piece of a jewel. And if you imagine, there can be large jewels and small ones and different shapes and sizes. But if you imagine that everything happens in the cosmos is like a particular jewel, when light shines in, each hanging jewel absorbs and reflects the light of every other. And for me, I turned it into glass because I think of like an immense glass chandelier is easier to sort of imagine. And I don't like the idea of everything being precious like a jewel. But so I have this idea of an immense glass constellation that every poem in the book is interplayed as part of this interdependent creation. And each poem, whether it's early or late, is absorbing and reflecting the light of every other. I mean, I've gone through a lot of stylistic changes as a writer. My voice has maybe grown or deepened or made different shifts, but like it or not, I can't escape my own obsessions. I write through them. And so for me, the Glass Constellation was a perfect image of all the poems being interdependent, relating to one another, and one not being more important than another. So a lot of my poetry is sort of almost anti-hierarchical, like the blowfish on the deck can be as important as the nickel and copper particulates coming down the river. There are these things that aren't weighed or said, one is more important or heavier than another. They coexist. So for me, the image of the Glass Constellation came to me. It's a long poem, and I thought that's perfect for the title of the book.
It is perfect.
Thanks. And we have some questions. How do we go about doing this?
Okay, I'm back just like that. It's sort of like Bewitched. I pop it in.
It even went bloop.
Well, it was great to hear both of you. Thank you so much. As I said, I'm a big fan. I'm going to start with a question from Ramona. She says she has a question for Arthur. Has he ever felt that he can't reach the seeds of might-be poem? I'm talking about writer's block. You can answer that too.
Yeah. It can't reach the what seeds?
The seeds, right. She says, Ramona says, has he ever felt that he can't reach the seeds of might-be poems? And Ramona is talking about writer's block. What's your experience?
Yes, I think that happens a lot. And I think even when one has seeds, some germinate and many don't. But that sense of not being able to reach the seeds is a really particular and interesting frustration. I think when I've had writer's block, actually more as a young poet than now, I worked with a wonderful poet, Josephine Miles, at University of California, Berkeley. And I remember once telling her, I've got writer's block, and she laughed and she said, you're like 21, how can you have writer's block? You should have more ideas than you know what to do with. But she said, if that happens to you, work on structures, work on the way that you're approaching the poem, how you're trying to arrive at the material that you're there. So to take the metaphor of the seed that's beyond reach, I think one way to do it is to back up and to try a different approach. And maybe one can actually arrive and discover that the seeds are then within reach. And sometimes that means trying too hard, being too conscious about, I want to put this incident in a poem and it's just not working and I can't seem to get it to grow organically. Sometimes that sense of, switch it, step back, let go, just if it needs to be there, it's going to somehow reassert itself, or you're going to find a different path to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because you talk about getting up so early and you're not entirely awake. And as Marie was saying, one gets out of one's own way and lets these things come up. And so I was wondering, Marie, I think of it in terms of getting up before my neuroses do.
Great. Get up faster.
So Marie, what about you? How do you get out of your own way then?
I think for me, writer's block is not in terms of I have too many words, they're always coming. I think for me, it's just more just showing up. It's like with meditation. I get up also at 4:30. I show up. Sometimes I'm just banging my head on the desk for half an hour. I think also when you're trying to drill down, if you show up, something will happen. And I agree with Arthur. Sometimes it is about seeing it in a different way or doing a quickie switch. I don't feel like it's a block. I feel like it's like not resisting it if it's too much. It's not a block so much as it's out there, and if you show up enough, it will show itself. And that's the same with meditation. Like, why am I meditating every day since I was 9? I mean, I started doing it. I didn't know what I was doing. My parents are Christian, and they just kind of flipped out. But I just did it every day because that's what you do. And then eventually something happens. I think it's about showing, it's like the seeds. You water the seeds, you don't see a lot, but then something happens one day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so Susie Wong asks, you mentioned the importance of knowing when to stop, not mess up a poem. So I guess this is for Arthur. How do you know when a draft becomes a poem? You talked about abandoning it as
right.
you said.
I have to, I'm not sure about abandoning. There's clearly a sense for me of letting go. I go through many, many drafts, and as I'm going through the drafts, I can kind of instinctively feel what phrases have maybe the most light or heat, the most vitality, and they start to come forward, and other phrases start to drop off. And as the poem sort of comes together, for me, that often involves sort of writing a lot and then condensing and bringing it down and shrinking it and sort of concentrating the energy. I find it very hard to then re-expand the poem back up. So as I'm generally, I'm generalizing, but generally as I'm focusing and honing the poem and bringing it in, there's a certain point I can instinctively know that the more I sort of fiddle with it, the more I'm going to mar it and mess it up. Or for today, it's just like I've gotten to a sense of exhaustion and I need to sort of let that be and let that go. And so oftentimes for me, again, it means not being in a hurry. I was shocked in my 20s to hear a poet in an interview say, sometimes I write a poem in the morning and then I'm done. I send it off to an editor in the afternoon. And it's like, oh my God, how do you know that it's done? Or, maybe that's a poet who writes, 100 poems a year. I write 10 pages a year to show you. The Glass Constellation's 500 pages, but it's 10 pages a year times 50 years. So it's actually a very slow process. I find that I have that draft and I just say, okay, I'm going to put it aside. And then two things. Sometimes it's really helpful to have other friends, other peers you can share work with, and you can think, this is done. And I'll show it to a friend and he or she'll something. And it's like, okay. How did I not see? Of course, I should make this change. It's like right there. And then other times, someone will say, no, I don't have anything to say. That sort of mirroring is helpful. But there's a sense of letting go and, again, not being in a hurry. And even just putting the poem away for a month and coming back and looking at it. And am I satisfied with the language? How the poem allowed to hear the sound? The rhythm, and I can kind of feel like that's it. That's the best I can do.
Okay, Arthur, I'm sorry, go ahead, Marie.
Oh, I was just going to say, what Arthur was saying also about tricking yourself into pretending you didn't write it is such a big thing. Like sometimes just changing the font is helpful. A lot of it really is it's hard for you to read your own stuff as if you didn't write it, and that's kind of the trick of it. So I kind of love the idea of putting it away and then looking at it again, because then a lot of times I think if you feel like, wow, this is really good, who wrote it? Then it's done. Would you agree with that, Arthur?
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, Marie, how you know when it's done, so now I know.
Pretty
Arthur,
much, right.
Arthur, we lost your image, I think. Maybe that's just a broadband issue. But we can hear you fine, so we can continue. Okay. Someone writes, I have a question for Arthur. You said the speaker when describing the poem about waiting. Oh, you said the speaker when describing a poem about waiting for the train. Are you yourself ever the speaker or protagonist of your poems? If not, who are the speakers? Do you envision a fleshed out person, or are they more mysterious? Good question.
Great question. Oftentimes, sometimes the I in my poem is myself in a particular situation. And in Doppler effect, I was actually sitting in a car and a train zipped by, and that's sort of was a moment that came to me. But I like to use the speaker because I don't always like to be so autobiographical. When I was first starting to write what was called the Confessional School of Poetry, was very big. Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, and it's all about sort of mining the self and taking the traumas of the self and making that sort of the fuel for poetry. And I guess maybe because I come from an Asian background, I found some of that, I don't know, egotistical or melodramatic, or just, it wasn't my sense of a self, really. It felt like it was inflated. So the I in my poems tends to be much more observational, less sort of an I sort of emptying all their, emotional baggage or whatever. But I like the ambiguity that the pronouns in poems can be rich in ambiguity. So like you could read a poem thinking, okay, that might be like the poet Arthur Sze, but it might be a speaker. It might be like a dramatic person on stage or in a story. That I doesn't have to be limited to the author per se. And that's where it gets rich in ambiguity to me, because I think I don't want to have to eliminate possibilities. And for instance, like a you in a poem, the last poem, have you articulated emotions like the edges of leaves? Well, the you could be addressed to a reader. It could be addressed to another person. I sometimes think of the you as addressing it to an aspect of myself. Like I'm asking myself, have I lived a full, an authentic life? Is this something I can say? But if I say, have I articulated emotions like the edges of leaves? It feels like borderline egotistical, or again, maybe from an Asian background. If I say, have you articulated, then that you is rich. It's like, it could be a part of myself. I'm having a dialogue. I could be turning to somebody. I could be involving the reader. Then I like how those simple pronouns are open to multiplicity, are open to possible readings.
I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, Marie.
Well, if I could add to that. So, Arthur, some of your poems, like that you didn't read, like Lichen Song or Salt Song, the protagonist is an inanimate object, which I also found deeply Asian, is sort of the animist idea. So you go beyond the egotistical to letting nature talk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we talked about that some in the podcast. If anybody's interested, they can hear more about this in the podcast I did with Arthur. I want to ask also about, Arthur, the appearance of science. Someone writes that they don't ordinarily think of science when they think of poetry, although for you, the two come together so seamlessly, perhaps because of your background, but it seems to me there's something more there, especially as you know, I love Doppler effect. So what do you have to say about sort of a naturalist's view of the world in your poetry?
With the time I have a sort of another complicated answer. I think in the beginning, when I first started to write poetry, I wanted to banish scientific terms from my poetry. I was like interested in nature poetry, ancient Tang Dynasty, classical Chinese poetry. And then I got to the stage where I felt like, well, wait a minute. I know the language of physics. I know the language of science. Why can't I use it? I should be able to use everything within my knowledge and grasp. And in the 1980s, Santa Fe is a very small community, but there's a place called the Santa Fe Institute that was founded by Murray Gell-Mann, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who thought scientists were becoming too narrow, that young scientists only knew physics. Murray himself knew 10 languages. I met him at a dinner party, and we became good friends, and we would have these wonderful conversations that went all over the world. And I still remember him telling me the etymology of the word ketchup. But he talked about quarks and subatomic particles and science. And I began to realize that some of those scientists really have a very mystical view of the world. There are sort of engineers and technological people who have a maybe more factual sense of the world. But when I talked to the physicists, they really had this wonderful sense of, I am very small in the large scheme of things. We know so little about that cosmos, how it really works. And, Murray was like, I chased this quark, this subatomic particle, for years and had them take like 400,000 photographs in a bubble chamber to verify it was there. And it was there, but it was like poetic justice. He imagined it. He did the math to show it could be there, and then they found it. And so I found these conversations with sort of pure scientists really interesting, because they really had a kind of childlike wonder about the world, even though they had math beyond my capacity. I felt a kinship as a poet, like we're still, that sense of wonder and awe at the world, that we both still feel it as a scientist or as a poet. And that helped me think, oh, I should be able to use that in my poetry. And I want a reader to recognize that, kitchen sink can be as important in a poem as moonlight, that we want to be open to everything.
Thank you, Arthur. Any final words, Marie? It's been so great hearing you both.
I just want to say, I get so thrilled. Arthur, what is it like to have your poem on the New York City subway, given that you were born in New York?
Yeah.
What's that like?
I guess, well, it was pretty wonderful, because so many people would like send me little snapshots from, Arthur, I'm on the 6th train or whatever. And look what's here. I just sat down, and it was up for quite a while. So it was fun to have that very short poem traveling up and down the subways of New York City.
Amazing.
Okay, well, so Arthur, congratulations again, and thank you, Marie, and to our listeners.
Get this book.
Yeah, I think that we put the link in the chat field. Yes, and certainly look up Marie's book too. You'll be seeing both in the magazine again. They're very generously contributing. And so thank you, Marie Myung-Ok Lee and Arthur Sze, for so generously taking the time to join us. And thank you to all our listeners. It was a real pleasure having you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
James.
so much, James.
Thank you, everybody,
Thank
for
you,
coming.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Arthur. Congratulations.